Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In this special six-part summer series, you will hear recordings of papers delivered at the Robert Menzies Institute's conference on the Menzies Ascendency, Implementing a Liberal Agenda and Consolidating Gains 1954 to 1961. The conference was held over 2 days from the 23rd to the 24th of November 2023. In today's episode of the summer series, you will hear from Professor Andrew Norton on Menzies and Higher Education, followed by Dr. Ted Ling on Robert Menzies, Canberra's Apostle, and finally Dr. Michael de Percy on Australia in the Atomic Age, Menzies' Legacy and Nuclear's Unrealised Potential.
So, the key event in higher education policy between 54 and 61 is the Murray Report of 1957. Menzies accepted the recommendations for substantial increases in funding and did so in ways with long-term consequences for both the funding of universities and the structure of Australian higher education. Now, Menzies saw this as very significant. So, at his retirement press conference in January 1966, he was asked by a journalist about what were his lasting achievements of his long reign in office, and he gave four. One was the formation of the Liberal Party itself. The second was the constant alliance with the Country Party. The third was ANZUS, and the fourth was university policy. So, of all his domestic policies, he regarded universities as the most important. Before we get to Murray or the 1954 period, we've got to backtrack a bit to Menzies' own views on education and the various policy developments that led to the Murray Report. So Greg Mellush talked about this at the first conference. So Menzies had a particular view of higher education, that it was not just a utilitarian, develop useful skills kind of thing. It was moral, even spiritual. And there are dozens of quotes from Menzies where he expresses this view, going back to fairly early in his career. After time as a barrister, constitutional cases, which we're going to talk about later in another session as well, and a Victorian state political career, Menzies entered federal parliament in 1934. Now, this actually reduced his chance of influencing policy on universities and higher education, because education was one of the residual powers of the states under the Australian Constitution, and so the Commonwealth had no power to legislate for universities, schools, or any form of education except in its own territories. And at the time, there were 6 universities, all with state founding legislation. During World War II, however, the Commonwealth's defence power provided a temporary foundation for its financial involvement in higher education. In 1943, there were regulations designed to ensure the necessary flow of graduates for the war effort, and this led to the first Commonwealth direct intervention in supporting students. So their fees were paid and there was a means-tested living allowance. And later on, this same power was used for the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme, under which servicemen could get education for their future careers. And eventually, nearly 60,000 people went to university under the Reconstruction Training Scheme. Now, Labor's initiatives in this area in the 1940s were not controversial. The Liberals supported them. And in July 1945, Menzies told Parliament that the Commonwealth's takeover of income tax powers during the war had basically substantially reduced the capacity of the states to fund education. And being a constitutional lawyer, he suggested using Section 96 of the Constitution to fix this, which allows the Commonwealth to make grants to the states on such terms and conditions as it thinks fit. Section 96, however, would not allow direct Commonwealth scholarships or support to students. It could only go via the states. Now, Labor was also concerned about this, and this led to the 1946 constitutional referendum, which David talked about yesterday. There were 3 referendums put up. The social services one, which also covered what David was talking about, included a provision so the Commonwealth could legislate to provide benefits to students. In the debate on this, on the wording of this, Menzies criticised it only on the grounds that it was a piecemeal treatment of a large problem. So he really thinks the Commonwealth needs more constitutional power in education. Now, generally, as you can see from the cartoon from the period, there was a lot of scepticism about these referendums, that it was part of this view that the Chifley Labor government, as it then was trying to centralise and increase control from Canberra. And sort of a very bad pun in the cartoon as well. Now, on election day, this was put to the people on election day 1946. Two of the referendums failed, but the social services referendum was successful and Menzies had said he was going to vote for it. So if this had not passed, his subsequent Commonwealth scholarship schemes would either have not existed at all or had to take a very, very different structure via the states. Now, as you all know, Menzies became Prime Minister in December 1949, and one of the first things he did in March 1950 was to announce the revision of a review that Chifley had already started before he lost office, something that was later known as the Mills Review. And part of the context of this was that the universities had been really struggling with all the additional students who'd come in via the Reconstruction Training Scheme. Mills reported in August 1950, the government had agreed at least by January 51, possibly early, haven't found that yet, but it wasn't actually legislated until November 1951. And the long delay in this was partly due to protracted negotiations with the states. And the reason for this was that this was going to be a tied grant to the states where they would have to spend or use the money as instructed by the Commonwealth. Now, from the Whitlam government onwards, Section 96 tied grants were an important instrument of expanding Commonwealth policy power. But in this era, even though they had been used sparingly for decades, they were still relatively unusual, and I think Menzies was quite conscious of the need to get the states on board on this issue. Even though he did get the states to agree, these conditions really put pressure back on both the Commonwealth and the universities. So this was there was some grant money just simply handed over, but there was also a contingent component on a basis of £1 from the Commonwealth for every £3 total of state grants to universities and student fees. So the states and the universities had to do things to get the money. Now, apart from the student fees part of the grant, which created additional pressure for the universities to charge their students fees, the conditions on the universities were minimal. The grants were phrased as being for general teaching and research purposes. And this reflected Menzies' view of the proper relationship between universities and the government. And what I've got here, I think, is a classic Menzian statement of the autonomy of the universities. It is not the desire of the government to interfere in the internal management of the universities, nor to attach conditions to the use of these monies which would interfere with their traditional liberty to determine the courses of instructions they wish to take or the character of the research they wish to undertake. Evatt, now as Leader of Opposition after the passing of Chifley, supported the bill, questioning only whether the amount was sufficient. And a future opposition leader towards the end of our 54-61 period, Arthur Caldwell, also supported the bill and Evatt's comments. Now, the benefits to students' power was, however, used to create the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme from 1951. So these were merit-based scholarships, which always paid the students' fees, and subject to a personal or parental income test, also provided a living allowance. Now, at the start, the Commonwealth scholarships were definitely helpful for some students, but their numbers, as you can see from the slide, were much lower than the peak of the Reconstruction Training Scheme scholarships. And indeed, total enrolments in universities fell during the early Menzies years. However, like the general grants for teaching and research purposes, the Commonwealth scholarships were flexible on courses. So the regulations do have a list of the eligible courses, but it covers almost everything you can think of, including arts, which is the humanities interest that Menzies had. Now, Menzies, at least in retrospect, recognised that these early measures, while establishing the Commonwealth's peacetime role in higher education, were not enough. So while nominal university revenue increased significantly in the 1950s, as you can see on the slide, an inflationary surge in the early 1950s, which was mentioned yesterday, quickly eroded the real value of the grants, which had been legislated with no indexation, and university finances remained precarious. As you can see, in most years, revenue and expenditure are basically the same. So by the beginning of our conference period in 1954, student enrolments were still below the Reconstruction Training Scheme peak, but had exceeded that by 1956, just under 35,000. But the universities were still really struggling. There was a lot of lobbying for a further review to look at this, and this is perhaps where Paul Kelly's comments about dragging the feet, Menzies dragging his feet in the 1950s, comes into play. But finally, after a dinner with Menzies in March 1956, he agreed in principle to such a review. Now, the formal invitations to the committee members were issued in December 1956 with Sir Keith Murray, who was chair of the UK University Grants Committee, also to be chair of Menzies' Review of Australian Universities. Now, the Murray Committee worked quickly and delivered its report in September 1957, and it offered a scathing assessment of Australian universities. In 1957, according to the Murray Report, students and academics were overcrowded in buildings that were grossly deficient. So that's actually the late 1940s, but you can sort of see the guy still wearing his gowns, teaching outside. High student fail rates, the report said, were a national extravagance which can ill be afforded. And the Murray Report contains much else that will be familiar to later higher education report authors, including David and myself. Issues of student academic preparation, the quality of teaching, the lack of industry doing its own research, the situation of overseas students, dissatisfied academic staff and shortages of graduates, including teaching, still an issue 66 years later. They concluded without quick action, the current critical situation, as they describe it, would turn catastrophic. So a very damning report on Australia's universities. What Australian universities should be, in the Murray Report's view, was very much in line with the Menzies vision. The report's authors assumed that university autonomy was essential and that universities had broad purposes beyond vocational training. In their substantive recommendations, they proposed a University Grants Committee, which would also plan the system, including new institutions. And they recommended significantly increased funding to remedy the problems that they had identified and support growth in the number of students. So Menzies was very keen on these recommendations. In his book, The Measure of the Years, Menzies gives an account of how these recommendations were funded. So this begins prior to a trip to England in 1956, when he first met personally with Keith Murray. Before Menzies departs for England, he tells Treasurer Artie Fadden that he was initiating an enterprise that could not fail to be vastly expensive. After gratuitously noting that Fadden was not himself a graduate but had a good Australian outlook and recognised that this was almost an obsession for his leader, Fadden gave the all clear, presumably not particularly voluntarily. After the Murray Report had been delivered, Menzies says in the Measure of the Years that Treasury had a full opportunity to examine the proposals. What he doesn't say, but his biographer Alan Martin does, is what Treasury thought of them. Predictably, Treasury did not like them, both due to the level of expenditure and the precedent of giving direct access to a Commonwealth body direct access to a Commonwealth body of state bodies for their financial requirements. So the universities were getting direct access to the Commonwealth. Menzies told a cabinet meeting called with, he says, 2 or 3 days' notice that he would like it to sit morning, afternoon and evening and reach its conclusions that night. The cabinet, he says, knowing this was an outstanding event in my life, humoured me and I am still grateful to them. The actual policy response came in stages, emergency funding distributed through the existing states grants mechanism, followed by the establishment of an Australian Universities Commission. Now, this AUC is a real turning point, I think, in seeing Australia's universities as a system rather than as a collection of state-based institutions. So the AUC provide information on planning the development of the system, including capital works and new institutions. Now, funding to the states increased pretty quickly after the Murray report, including this new provision for capital grants. And these grants help finance a range of new or expanded institutions in the Menzies years and the years shortly afterwards. So this is really a golden period in the expansion of higher education institutions. And my university, ANU, also developed. So ANU could be funded directly under the Constitution, so these are all separate, and the ANU also got additional funding. The Murray Committee recommended increased scholarships, especially for postgrad study, which had been omitted earlier. Oops. Yeah, so the number of students nearly doubled between 1954 and 1961, although Commonwealth scholarships lagged well behind the increase in student numbers. So Commonwealth scholarships only went up by about 40%. Though it is important to stress at this time, Commonwealth scholarships were only about half of all the scholarships available to university students. As Menzies had when introducing previous increases in university funding, he met with no opposition from Labor. In the second reading debate for the Australian Universities Commission Bill, Evatt declared Labor's enthusiastic support. Now, despite all these major developments, new institutions, additional funding, the issues of post-school education did not go away. The first report of the Australian Universities Commission, which was delivered in October 1960, said the number of students was increasing more quickly than expected, and they anticipated this rapid growth would continue. The report suggested that new university institutions were required, and said the Commission had decided to seek the assistance of an advisory committee on this matter. Now, this is what turns out to be the Martin Review. So Martin was the chair of the Australian Universities Commission and was going to do this review. And that was announced by Menzies in August 61. But Menzies' comments on the October 1960 report struck a very different overall tone to his response to the Murray report 3 years previously. While reiterating his strong support for university education, he was no longer ignoring or overriding Treasury objections to this expansion. And he says in Parliament, the government has taken the view that unless there is an early and substantial modification of the university pattern, away from the traditional 19th century model on which it is now based, it may not, and I say with reluctance, be practical for Australian governments to meet all the needs for university education in Australia and at the same time to achieve the best use of resources in the national interest. We think, therefore, that the development of alternative kinds of tertiary education is likely to be of the greatest importance. Now, the eventual result of this was of the Martin Review, which is implemented outside the time period of this conference, was the binary divide, so-called binary divide in higher education between universities on one side and colleges of advanced education and institutes of technology on the other. Now, in thinking about the role of Menzies in the development of Australian higher education, we need to consider the counterfactuals. The expansion of university education supported by the Commonwealth was not a major issue of partisan divide between the 1940s and early 1960s. Menzies said kind things in Parliament about Labor's policies in the 1940s, and they returned to favour in the 1950s and 1960s. It is near certain that if Labor had stayed in power in 1949 with the Mills Review already announced by Chifley, or returned in one of the close-run elections in 1954 and 1961, it too would have substantially increased Commonwealth funding in universities, as it eventually did when it returned to power in the early 1970s. Another counterfactual is a Liberal government with someone other than Menzies as leader. I think spending probably still would have gone up because there's a lot of pressure building to expand the university system, but not by as much as it did under Menzies, and certainly not by as much as it did with the Murray report. And the Murray recommendations went through Cabinet due to the prestige and pressure of the Prime Minister and wouldn't have happened otherwise. By 1960, however, Menzies recognised that a large percentage increase in students from a very low base, which had happened since the mid-1950s, was much easier and cheaper than moving to a genuine mass higher education system. In 1961, Australia's universities enrolled just under 58,000 students. Now there are 7 or 8 universities that have more than that on their own. It's an entirely different level of scale. Another counterfactual question is whether one of the non-Menzies scenarios, a Labor or a different Liberal leader, would have led to the same light touch controls over how universities use their money. Although more central steering did come to the system with the AUC from 1959, planning had been very, very fashionable in the 1940s, especially on the Labor side. So it's not hard to imagine they would have been more prescriptive. The state government scholarships that operated alongside the Commonwealth scholarships were often bonded, so it tied the student's support to a particular course with the return of service in a particular occupation after the course. And so it's not hard to imagine a national version of the same system, whereas Menzies was giving huge flexibility in what courses students could take. From 1964, after the time period of this conference, but interesting for a contrast, John Grattan took primary responsibility for education. Now, Grattan refused to authorise the recommended expenditure for some research without further information, the first sign of Liberal university research scepticism with echoes to this day. According to Susan Davies, who's the author of a book on the Martin reforms, Grattan preferred the more vocational colleges to the universities, both on the grounds that they were cheaper and of more direct benefit to the community. Ouch. I think Grattan's more utilitarian and transactional approach was probably the more typical Liberal attitude of subsequent decades and quite possibly of the Liberal party room of the 1950s and 1960s. But Menzies' authority meant that view did not prevail. I think the Grattan view is a long way from Menzies' idealistic view of university education, but the national policy structures that Menzies created could end up serving and did end up serving a very wide range of policy goals. Thank you.
I wanted to thank Georgina and Zachary for asking me to speak here today. So we'll start off with a précis of what I'm going to talk about. Robert Menzies first moved to Canberra in 1934 to take up the position of Attorney General in Joseph Lyon's government. In his later memoir, The Measure of the Years, Menzies admitted he didn't like Canberra much at first, regarding it as a place of exile, but he realised the decision to make Canberra the capital had been taken and there was no going back. It was necessary, therefore, to make the city a focal point for national pride and sentiment. Once I had converted myself to this faith, he wrote, I became an apostle. From a position of indifference towards Canberra when he first moved there, Menzies became Canberra's champion. Menzies was instrumental in establishing the National Capital Development Commission in 1957. The Commission's task was to plan for, develop and construct Canberra, both as a place in which to live and as the national capital. It did all this until its abolition in 1989. Throughout its lifetime, it had a dramatic impact on Canberra's planning and development. Today, older Canberrans remember it as NCDC, while many younger Canberrans have probably never heard of it. What is also sometimes forgotten is the substantial role that Menzies had in the Commission's creation and operation until his retirement. Menzies fought for the Commission and the funding it needed to carry out its work, despite regular criticism from the states and even from within his own party. Okay, but now we'll go back in time. By the late 1940s, Canberra consisted of a few disjointed suburbs on either side of where the future Lake Burley Griffin would be. The effects of the Great Depression and World War II were still being felt. Walter Burley Griffin's grand design had come to little, and the nation's capital appeared to be little more than a series of suburbs still searching for a city. Furthermore, most Commonwealth departments were based in Melbourne, making effective administration from Canberra exceedingly difficult. In April 1948, Ben Chifley's government announced plans for the relocation of 7,000 public servants from Melbourne to Canberra over the next 10 years. Yet little happened. Shortages of manpower, materials, lack of funding and public service resistance, and that was a key factor, all helped to undermine the government's plans. During the election campaign of December 1949, Menzies gave little regard to Canberra, but he soon appreciated the problems that Chifley's government had faced. A series of cabinet committees was established after the election, one of which was on the development of Canberra. In March 1950, Menzies wrote to the committee's chairman, Philip McBride, Minister for the Interior, asking for a report on future development. McBride later transferred to the defence portfolio, and there is no evidence that the report Menzies called for was actually prepared. In January 1952, Menzies met with Bill Dunk, chairman of the Public Service Board. Dunk told Menzies of the work he had done for the Chifley government and his proposals for relocating public servants to Canberra. He called for the introduction of a development plan and the centralisation of the public service in Canberra. In July 1954, the government finally announced its intention to transfer more than 6,000 public servants to Canberra. In response to the announcement, the Canberra Times, it's our newspaper, published an editorial in which it said, "Nothing could be less profitable than to recall the number of occasions on which Commonwealth governments have committed themselves to a program for the transfer of departments from Melbourne to Canberra, only to abandon those intentions when it became more expedient politically to cut the financial provision for Canberra than for electorates which have greater voting power, other than the ACT. The government's 1954 proposal effectively went nowhere." The beginnings of Canberra's resurgence. In November 1954, Senator John McCallum called for the appointment of a Senate Select Committee to examine and report on the development of Canberra. When alerted to the committee's pending establishment, Menzies said, "I see no objection." The committee was duly formed, presented its report in September 1955. The report contained 76 recommendations. Canberra's post-war resurgence can be set almost to an exact day, the 6th of March 1956. This was with the birth of a baby girl, Edwina Henderson. She was the Menzies' first grandchild, and they absolutely doted on her. But her birth brought home to the Prime Minister the poor state of Canberra's facilities. Menzies was soon being harassed by his wife Patty and daughter Heather about the lack of facilities in Canberra. This was Patty Menzies. "Bob, you try pushing a pram around these awful footpaths." And then Heather Henderson, "Dad, it's almost impossible to find somewhere to live here." To which Menzies replied, "Well, we're stuck with Canberra whether we like it or not, so we might as well do it properly." In April that year, possibly as a result of the harassment he was getting at home, Menzies undertook a drive through Canberra. He was not impressed with what he saw. He noted the prevalence of squat, flat-top buildings, which he said needed only a few bales of hay and a goat on the roof to be painfully reminiscent of Suez or Port Said. He later wrote to Alan Fairhall, Minister for the Interior, voicing his concerns. He concluded by saying, "I will turn a very cold eye on proposals for Canberra unless I am satisfied that the business is being attended to in a business-like and effective way." Prior to leaving for a conference in London in July 1956, Menzies spoke with Ken Hurd. Hurd was a senior official with the Prime Minister's Department. Menzies asked him to prepare a paper on Canberra's problems, together with ideas on how they could be resolved so that Canberra's future planning and development could be corrected. Hurd presented his report that same month. He wrote that the government had to accept Canberra as an essential national responsibility and develop the city as a national project. He suggested a separate authority be established to develop Canberra over the next 5 to 7 years. The authority would undertake the planning, supervision, coordination, directing and expediting of all construction work in Canberra. Hurd also suggested that the government seek advice from a person who had proved themselves in this field, and he suggested William Holford, Professor of Town Planning at the University of London. Cabinet considered Hurd's recommendations in November 1956. While there was general support for the recommendations, there was one holdout, Paul Hasluck, Minister for the Territories. He was reluctant to commit to Canberra's development. During the discussion, he said, quote, "If we think of the relevant importance of things, we would put the development of the national capital fairly low on the list of priorities." Menzies took an entirely different view. He told his colleagues that there had to be a concentration of policy-making departments in Canberra and that elements of defence should be the first to relocate. What was required was a program of developing the city with the provision of schools, services and roads. Menzies supported the suggestion of an authority solely responsible for achieving this goal. He said, "If we don't decide now that this process will occur, it will not happen in our lifetime." The government later approved the engagement of William Holford, recommended by Ken Hurd. He spent 2 weeks in Canberra in June 1957 before returning home to London. Coincidentally, Menzies was in London at the same time, and the two men met at the Savoy Hotel. Holford wrote a record of the meeting in which he said that Menzies told him to speak frankly about his ideas. The two men discussed housing, the need for an auditorium for concerts and a theatre, a new Commonwealth Avenue bridge and the filling of the lake below, and possible sites for a new Parliament House. Holford told Menzies that a commission was needed with power and resources to develop Canberra over a period of 5 to 10 years. Menzies agreed and suggested that while there might be some opposition from the press, the Australian public would not object to the provision of £5 million per year for the next 10 years to develop a genuine capital city. Here I have to say I think Menzies was a bit overly optimistic, possibly even naive, if he thought the Australian public was going to accept a proposal of spending £5 million a year on Canberra for 10 years. And indeed, as Menzies soon found out, the opposition, the criticisms came thick and fast. Menzies asked Holford if he could return to Canberra in the near future, and Holford concluded his note by saying, "The Prime Minister seemed very keen on taking the necessary steps to lay down a revised program for Canberra before leaving office." Later, Menzies cabled Arthur Fadden, who was acting Prime Minister in his absence, informing him of the meeting with Holford. He said, "I found Holford's opinions impressive and lively." Legislation to establish the single authority supported by Menzies and others came into effect in late 1957, although it would not become fully operational until early 58. It was known as the National Capital Development Commission, the name originally suggested by Ken Hurd. In February 1959, the Commission released its first 5-year plan of proposed capital works for Canberra. The program included the lake, preparation for a new Parliament House on the shores of the lake, and many other things. The proposed works came at an eye-watering cost of £55 million. Menzies was still on board, even though such a massive amount of money, it hadn't fazed him, at least not totally. Cabinet considered the program in late April '59. Menzies was overseas at the time but had already made known his support for the program, particularly funding for the lake, which was approved by those ministers present at the meeting. The first new facility to be completed under this program of work was a building for defence in the suburb of Russell. The Russell Defence Complex would ultimately house 2,500 defence personnel in 7 buildings. Menzies officially opened the first building in November 1960. He used the opportunity to answer criticisms of the funding already being provided to Canberra. He said that the investments in Canberra were, and I quote, dividend-paying investments in the best sense of the word. They represented an investment in national pride and feeling. The moaning over the lake scheme and other projects in the building of Canberra gained no sympathy from him. Perhaps to lighten the mood, Menzies also took the opportunity to praise John Overall, who was Chief Commissioner of the National Capital Development Commission. He said, "Now this man Overall occasionally frightens me. He looks to you to be a mild and disarming character. He has associated with him commissioners of great talent who are equally mild and disarming. But I'll tell you the great secret of this man. When he learns on the telephone that the Cabinet has approved of something, some scheme, some project that concerns him, he has the bulldozers on the site the next morning." In the next few years, other projects would come to fruition and Menzies would be asked to attend the official opening. First of which was the Kings Avenue Bridge over the new lake, which opened in March '62. It cost £818,000. Again, there was criticism, and again, Menzies defended the cost, saying that the funding was not wasted. Anything spent here to make Canberra a better place will attract more people. Next one was Monaro Mall, a shopping centre, which was opened in March '63. The mall, located in the city centre of Canberra, was the first Australian 3-storey, fully enclosed and air-conditioned shopping centre. Construction began in July '61 and Menzies opened the facility in March '63. I have to confess now, this was one occasion where Menzies didn't have to defend this building against public criticism, but there's a wonderful quote he gave and I couldn't resist it, I just had to put it in. Menzies recounted how he came to Canberra 13 or 14 years ago when the population was 6,000. Now the population was 60,000. He said that in a city like Canberra, you are entitled to have the last word in shopping facilities, and here I think you have them. Then he went on. Menzies said everything in the mall was displayed so invitingly that women would spend more money than their husbands could afford. It is wonderful, immoral, tempting and terribly satisfactory. Okay, opening of the government printing office. This was a facility that Menzies opened in August '63. The facility had cost £3.3 million to build. Referring to the office's many achievements, Menzies asked his audience if they had ever wondered at the millions of words the office had had to cope with from politicians. He said he had tried to calculate the previous night before going to sleep how many words he himself had spoken in the last 35 years. But after approaching the 1 million mark, I fell into a sleep thickly studded with nightmares. Robert Menzies and the lake. The most notable construction event during this time was the beginning of the lake. Over the years, there have been calls to build a lake of some description, but the work had never proceeded. The National Capital Development Commission argued that the lake was essential to the proper development of Canberra, and it provided the only effective means of integrating the two parts of Canberra into a single city. Initial funding for the lake was approved by Cabinet in late April 1959. Although not present at the actual meeting, Menzies had argued strenuously for the funding. He was overseas at the time, happy in the knowledge that the funding had been secured. What he didn't realise was that the Treasury was vehemently opposed to the funding for the lake, and they got to work on several ministers while Menzies was away and got them to agree that the funding be struck out. Menzies returns and finds out what's happened. So the next meeting of Cabinet, he asked his colleagues, he said, I have been informed that the funds I thought had been secured for the lake have been struck out. Have I been told correctly? Knowing full well, of course, he had been. So then he said, well, can I now say with the support of all ministers present here that the funds are struck back in? And they were. Without Menzies' efforts, it's unlikely that the lake would ever have been built. Work on the lake began in September 1960 with the construction of Scrivener Dam, which is named after a surveyor, Charles Scrivener. The dam's valves were closed in September 63, allowing the lake to fill. Although it was assumed that the lake would be full by the end of the year, as luck would have it, Canberra was in drought. And so the lake didn't fill until April 64. I've actually spoken with people who were in Canberra, or living in Canberra at the time, and when the lake actually filled, this was a big deal because for months people were living with this empty lake and 2 road bridges going over it and with very minimal water in the lake. Finally, the lake was full. Menzies opened the lake on the 17th of October 1964. Despite suggestions from ministers that the lake be named after him, Menzies declined, noting that at the time there was no monument dedicated to Walter Burley Griffin. Once more, Menzies was obliged to counter criticisms concerning the money spent on Canberra. He said, I quote, Australians had a natural instinct for parochial thinking and for thinking in terms of states and state loyalties. It was a hard and constant battle to make people understand that the Commonwealth was not a foreign power, that the Commonwealth was something that was interwoven through the whole structure of Australia and in the hearts and minds of the people. The nation is more important than any part of it, and the nation is symbolised by the capital. Laying the foundation stone for the National Library. One of Menzies' last official functions for Canberra was laying down the foundation stone for the National Library in March 1966. Menzies said that the library was located in a city to which he had devoted a great deal of thought, egged on, he said, by Paddy Menzies, who was perhaps the most one-eyed supporter of Canberra to be found in the world. Menzies said he'd like to live long enough to be brought along in a wheelchair or ushered aboard a boat on the lake and see the magnificent white library reflected in the water, the Parliament House on the lake shore, the High Court on the other side of the Parliament. I don't know if he actually did come back. I mean, the library was finished in 1968, but I don't know whether he actually came back and saw it. I'd like to think he did. But it's interesting, he talks about the Parliament House being on the lake. Well, of course, that never happened. And also the High Court being on the other side of the lake. That never happened either. They're both on the same side of the lake. So, conclusion. Robert Menzies retired as Prime Minister in January 1966. In that moment, Canberra lost its apostle. In fact, it lost its champion. I don't think the National Capital Development Commission fully realised at the time their champion was gone. It took a few years to sink in because Menzies had been so dominant and so supportive of Canberra, it was almost taken for granted that he'd always be there. He had fought tirelessly for the city and its development, despite regular criticism. In his memoir, he later wrote, I remember how every penny spent on Canberra used to be grudged and how many arguments I had to engage in when travelling from state to state. I am delighted in my old age to think that Australia's capital has now become an object of pride and pleasure. This was always a national conclusion, devoutly to be wished. When opening the first building at the Defence Complex in Russell in November 1960, Menzies said he wished he could return to Canberra in 50 years to see the fruits of the government's labour. Canberra would by then be a marvel, a pride and a joy. If Menzies had returned to Canberra after 50 years, he'd have seen a city of about 358,000 people. Remembering when he moved to Canberra in 1934, the population was 6,000. When he opened the Monaro Shopping Centre in 1963, the population was 60,000. So if he had returned, it would have been 358,000. Right now, it's in the high 400,000s and closing rapidly on 500,000. The city was spreading in all directions. 4 satellite cities had been established: Woden, Belconnen, Tuggeranong and Gungahlin. A number of national buildings had been completed, including Parliament House, the High Court, the National Gallery, the National Museum and Questacon. And Menzies' wish to have the public service centralised in Canberra had been realised. Finally, if he had come back, Menzies would have seen the R.G. Menzies Walk, a 2-kilometre walk along the northern edge of Lake Burley Griffin, which was opened in 2012. It was designed to recognise the lake and the importance of Menzies' contribution to its creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach, and it's a real privilege to be here. So much has been written about Menzies in the context of the idea of nuclear colonialism, and a lot of this comes from the McClellan Commission, the Royal Commission held in 1985 into the nuclear tests in Woomera, Montbello and Maralinga. Now, an unfortunate thing about Royal Commissions is there's often a distinction between fact and opinion. And we saw that recently. Gerard Henderson did a great job of pointing that out about the Cardinal George Pell and the Royal Commission there. I think one of the issues that I'm really focused on, and if I can just point out, I'm a political scientist, not an historian, so I'm sure many of you will know more historical facts about certain things than I will, but what I'm hoping to achieve in my contribution is to recast that narrative around Menzies in the atomic era. And so I'll talk a little bit about my method, which won't appear necessarily in the chapter, but I'd like to provide you with an understanding of where I'm sort of coming from. I think too that what hasn't been spoken about with Menzies is the unrealised potential of our nuclear industry, and he actually presided over that very important period. And I think even though we have not sort of realised a great deal of that potential, it is unrealised potential. It's still there. It's something that we can still adopt at the moment. The really interesting thing is just yesterday, Chris Bowen has gone to the UN Climate Change Council meeting, and Australia is basically the only country that's not adopting nuclear as part of its carbon emissions reduction scheme. So I dare say that international pressure, including the cost of living crisis we're going through, is going to put much more pressure on Bowen to reconsider. Now, this is unfortunate for Labor, of course, because their narrative has all been about anti-nuclear, that it's bad, that it's dirty, and so on. And I guess what I'm really trying to do here is to unpack their narrative and issue a new narrative about Menzies and the positive aspects of this very important technology. And just to give you an idea of how important it is, I find it really interesting when we hear particularly people of the Green Left ilk, if you will, talk about using their mobile phones and technology and so on. But I hear from a scientist at ANSTO just the other day at a presentation that if it wasn't for the nuclear industry, mobile phones wouldn't exist. So, a great deal of the technology that we're talking about is a result of this particular industry. And I think there's a lot of false narratives that go to a particular ideal that need to be addressed. What I'm going to do in the paper is trace the development and the subsequent stagnation of the nuclear industry in Australia. I'm going to focus on Sir Robert's legacy, but also his influence on energy and defence policy today. There are a number of pieces of trivia that were really interesting that came up in some of the study I've done. We actually covered that on the Afternoon Light podcast. So if you're interested in the sort of really interesting tidbits there, they're in the podcast. And there were some great questions there from Georgina. Now, in terms of the method, now in political science there's a method known as historical institutionalism. And what it does is it traces the processes of politics over time. This is I actually adopt this as a method, and I've developed a model of path-dependent punctuated equilibrium. Let me put that in normal terms. Basically, once you start a policy, it's really hard to undo it. And you have then legacies of that initial policy which inform the next policy. And it's really interesting when we look at the 1985 McClellan Commission into Maralinga and elsewhere, all of the sort of blame fell on Menzies for enabling this to happen. But it actually happened in 1946 under the Chifley government. They actually agreed to all of these tests and the locations in the first instance. We don't hear that in the narrative. So in terms of how I approach this particular paper is I've started with chronologies of the sort of technological developments, resource discoveries in Australia, and also the Allies' decisions around how nuclear weapons in the first instance would be developed. And there are a number of coinciding arrangements between the United States, the United Kingdom, that had an important impact on Australia's nuclear development. One of the key things I've noticed is that there is a real process of nuclear development. Now, obviously it starts with nuclear weapons, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the first instance, but then after the war, it immediately focuses on, well, how do we develop this for elsewhere? And of course, the United States was heavily involved with Canada because Canada had discovered uranium. Now, at this point in time, Australia had not discovered its own uranium resources. We did have radium, which was used for sort of glow-in-the-dark gauges and things like that, but there was no sort of real knowledge of what we had in terms of resources here. So, of course, the Canadians were very important to the US. They were heavily involved in the Manhattan Project. Now, the UK was also involved, but after the war, the US decided that they would not share their technology as widely as they had first envisaged. So the UK went on its own mission to look at using the remnants of the empire to develop technical scientific skills and also resources to help with their own development of their own weapon, given that the US was not going to provide that information to them. So Australia very much became a part of that. Now, the really interesting thing is that Australia actually wanted nuclear weapons straight after the war. In 1946, part of our defence policy was going to be that we couldn't really rely on the UK, and this had been proven with the fall of Singapore, that the US, and you know, many people don't even realise that there were tens of thousands of Americans who died defending this country. And I think that's a legacy that Koreans know this legacy well of Australia's contribution and the US contribution, but I think we've sort of let that narrative disappear, and I think that's a major mistake in our teaching of history. But again, we necessarily can't rely on the US or the UK when it comes to real politics. So Australia was really keen to have a deterrent because a nuclear weapon is a deterrent. If I can put it in context, so in Gaza at the moment, population just a bit bigger than the Australian Capital Territory. They have the equivalent of the Australian Army operating there as militant soldiers organised into battalions. So, you know, that we're not a hard target. We're very much a soft target. Our capabilities are very limited. We rely on these external alliances, which are tricky at best. And of course, that's exacerbated by our trade relationships at the moment. So back in the day, nuclear weapons were seen as one way of making us a hard target. If you wanted to attack us, you'd be dealing with some serious retaliation. So what ended up happening was we went from weapons to then under Truman, I think it was, the Atoms for Peace, and started looking at nuclear energy. But before that happened, there was much experimentation around nuclear science. So research, experiments and skills capability were the initial focus in Australia. That then developed into medical products. Nuclear energy, Menzies thought, would not become affordable until at least the 1970s. And of course, because of our abundance of coal and the absence of emissions targets back in the day, there was no real need to invest in that particular industry, let history take its course, and it would happen organically. But there's a really interesting progression from research and medical products to nuclear energy, then to nuclear weapons. Historically, it didn't happen in that order, but there's an order of morality that's attached to that particular narrative. So if you can save lives with nuclear research and medical products, that's a great thing. Nuclear energy, if it can solve problems of emissions, then that's increasingly being seen as a good thing. Nuclear weapons, however, is a step too far. But in Australia, the narrative has been all about that nuclear is bad, and that's the end of the story. Studies that look at whether or not people are interested in living nearby a nuclear reactor indicate that it's much closer than you would think, but most people don't realise that Australia's nuclear reactor is within 25 kilometres of the Sydney CBD anyway, and it has been there since 1958. So, a lot of this is about marketing and the narrative, as opposed to the reality. And if you haven't been, I urge you, get out to Lucas Heights and have a look. It's an incredible experience. And many young people who have been there have become converts for nuclear energy as a result of seeing what's actually happening. So that particular narrative, it builds on my earlier work. I'm really interested in, over the period where we had a series of prime ministers in quick succession, it was interesting that there wasn't time to deviate from what had been established previously. So we saw in a lot of policy areas that we had basically the next government picking up the previous government's policies, modifying it a little bit, but essentially moving that forward, And then, of course, it was very difficult to develop anything new as each new successive government came along. Now, Menzies, of course, had this very long tenure, the longest of tenures in Australian political history at least, which enabled him to at least start the development of the process. So what I wanted to look at, though, in particular, was a little bit of the chronology, and I won't go through each of these in detail, but basically what happens is in 1946, under the Chifley government, Australia gears up for nuclear weapons. The Australian National University was actually established to help develop nuclear weapons. Now, can you imagine the ANU dealing with this sort of policy today? It's almost farcical. But at the same time, we had the development of the Snowy Hydro scheme. Now it's been recast to this sort of great sort of, and rightly so, multicultural sort of infrastructural project. The reality is that Snowy Hydro was actually meant to be a place where there was sufficient water to develop a breeder reactor to create plutonium and to create nuclear weapons. So again, this narrative has been recast to make it more palatable to the non-proliferation ideals that have since developed. Now, it's really interesting that Menzies is subject to this legacy. It's already established, the agreement between Australia and the UK for developing skills in nuclear science, for nuclear weapons testing and so on. It's already there, so it's not like he sort of created it as the narrative has been recast. It's also interesting that in the same year, uranium is discovered in Australia and the Rum Jungle mine commences. So Menzies really is at the beginning of this, but he's not the initiator of many of these issues, but he does pick it up in ways that we benefit from in the present. So again, I don't want to go too much over the chronological detail, but it's really interesting that what starts to happen in the 1970s, after Menzies' tenure, with the French testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific, public opinion, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's actually Grattan who signs the treaty, doesn't ratify it, but signs the treaty. It was a Liberal government that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in the Australian, in recent years, it was reported that Grattan actually wanted nuclear weapons. Like, he really didn't want to sign it. It was a matter of political expediency. McMahon, on the other hand, he didn't want nuclear weapons. So we had this sort of ongoing issue within the Liberal Party, and it actually goes back to Menzies' time. So Menzies was a bit ambivalent about nuclear weapons. He was a bit unsure. He thought nuclear energy was something that should happen. He certainly thought that the nuclear science and skills development was necessary, but he was a bit unsure about nuclear weapons. In the meantime, Grattan, unbeknownst to Menzies, had started pushing to develop those weapons as well. Again, this is something that had been going on in the background, resulting from the Defence Science Conference in London in 1946. So it was a sort of ongoing process that was outside of day-to-day politics. Now, we saw, and just to pick up on this theme of political compromise, when John Howard got, if it wasn't for John Howard, we wouldn't have the current Opal reactor. And again, if you go to Lucas Heights and you have a look at the old HIFARS reactor, compare its capabilities to the new one is significantly more efficient and can produce greater amounts of experiments. It's not even operating at full capacity, so there is redundant capacity there for the future as well. Whereas the old HIFARS, it had really had its day. Each experiment was very difficult and time-consuming. But that compromise enabled, with Meg Lees, to effectively prohibit nuclear energy was a compromise that enabled us to have the Opal reactor. So really it comes down to having the courage to change that prohibition as opposed to it being something that we can't change. And of course, at the moment, we've got the nuclear energy mix versus the current minister's crash through or crash approach to our energy policy. But look, when we come back again to the launch point, it was that Prime Minister's conference in London, chiefly accepting the projects that Menzies was later effectively blamed for. It was a strategy that was inherited by the Menzies government. There was a general belief that the UK would provide Australia with nuclear weapons, but eventually this didn't happen. So I think that idea of nuclear deterrence really sort of, it really disappeared after the end of the Vietnam War. But if we go back, the Malayan emergency was an area where the Menzies government was really keen, the Australian government was really keen to have a nuclear deterrent, and again in the Korean War and so on. But for Menzies, he saw that nuclear technology would become economical for energy by the 1970s, that it could be used for things like desalination. And one of the really interesting things was that also nuclear explosions could be used to dig massive craters to store water. Now, I don't think we would be thinking about that sort of thing today, but it was a process that was actually being used and experimented with at the time. So, look, I've spoken about quite a few of these issues, so I might just skip through. How am I going for time? I've got a couple of minutes. So basically, what happens is we end up with the reactor opened in 1958 by Sir Robert at Lucas Heights. The cabinet is divided on pushing alone with a nuclear deterrent, particularly because of the cost. There was it was envisaged by the Australian Atomic Energy Agency, which is now ANSTO, or a forerunner of ANSTO, that they couldn't produce breeder reactors until the last quarter of the 1900s. The focus shifted to atomic energy at Lucas Heights, which of course was then undone by the 1970s. And of course with the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was an unexpected backflip for those who were previously members of the Menzies government. I I guess we still have that underlying capability, but it's not part of the political narrative of the present. So at the present, it's still about nuclear is a bad thing, that nuclear energy will lead to proliferation and so forth. The reality is that is always a possibility. There's always that possibility. So it is something to be cautious of, but at the same time, I think our political system enables us to handle these sorts of issues in ways that can benefit us rather than potentially harm us. But nuclear remains a hot potato, and I think that's part of the legacy of the Menzies era, but at least we have a foot in the game, so to speak. So what we saw, though, was a losing of momentum, particularly in the 60s and into the 1970s, and basically we get to the point where we've come full circle now. So international affairs were a major driver for early nuclear adoption, and I think they're going to be not about defence, but certainly about climate policy being an international problem, that is going to drive our adoption of nuclear energy in the near future. Our sector has declined, but it is still world regarded. I think one of the biggest problems is not only has the ALP tried to rewrite history, but at one stage we had some 8 Australian universities contributing to nuclear science, and that has basically fallen by the wayside. And I think there's some real problems that are starting to appear, and it was spoken about looking at the history curriculum in schools recently. One of the problems I find is that when you let government choose what skills are developed, you get the skills that government chooses. Whereas if you actually let the market decide what skills are necessary, then hopefully we get better skills. And just a really quick example, we're at a factory recently where they have 20 high-end Japanese welding robots, and not a single person in Australia who has the ability to fix the software. So those 20 robots are sitting there doing nothing, costing a fortune, because there's nobody in Australia who has the skills to make them work. And that's just a disgrace. But again, where do you get these skills from? You certainly don't get it from government choosing what the market needs, in my view at least. So the ALP's tried to rewrite this history, but I think AUKUS has given us the opportunity to reinvigorate this discussion, and I think what we really need to see is that rather than thinking of Menzies as being the person who created this colonial sort of impost on Australian people and our population, that he actually enabled something that we're really going to need right now. And that's really what I'm aiming at. I've got some of my key references here. If you have a look on my website, politicalscience.com.au, the slides are all available for you and you can download those. But otherwise, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.